Good morning. Thank you, worship team. You know, a few weeks ago when I preached the first sermon on holding the things of this world loosely, I thought it was just going to be a single sermon, and the Lord's just been unraveling revelation beyond just that one sermon. It wasn't intended to be a series, but it's becoming a series, and so we're going to keep pressing in the things that He's equipping us for in this year, the thing that He's doing and calling. In that first sermon, we talked about how if we're holding tightly to the things of this world, we'll never be able to fully grasp the things of His kingdom, the things that He wants to pour out. We talked about Matthew 6:33, and seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. All these other things will be taken care of. Then in the second week, we talked about, well, if we're not to cling to the things of this world, if we're to cling to God and His kingdom, what does that look like? What is that for? And we talked about betrothal. And we went through Jewish betrothal and wedding customs, and how that creates a picture of what Jesus is telling His disciples before He goes to the cross and died and resurrects and ascends back to heaven. He says, I'm coming back. Just like a young groom would say, I'm coming back to the one he's betrothed to. That recognizing that we're preparing for a wedding changes our everyday life. It changes the to-do list. It's not just a to-do list. We're preparing for the groom. We're preparing for the king who's returning. You don't hear a bride get up on her wedding day and think, oh man, I got to get ready for my wedding. You don't hear a groom say, oh man, I got to plan this honeymoon. I'm planning the honeymoon right now. It's going to be dialed in. We're still months away, but I know it's going to be dialed in. It's not a heavy load to plan a honeymoon. It's not a heavy load to prepare for a wedding. We're preparing for the groom who's coming. It changes everything about our walk, our pursuit of Jesus, when our heart recognizes what we're pursuing, what we're preparing ourselves for. So this week we're going to talk about how holding the world loosely actually allows us to step it out in faith. It allows us to walk in faith. Because if we're holding tightly to the things of the world, our faith is going to be in the world. If we're holding tightly to the things we can control, our faith is in ourselves. But if we hold tightly to His kingdom and His righteousness, then our faith is in the King. The one who establishes that kingdom, the one who rules that kingdom. And so by holding things lightly here, we'll grasp tightly the things of God's kingdom, and we'll walk in faith. Recently, the Lord prompted me to take a step of faith. I'm not going to share the details this morning, but He prompted me to take this step of faith. And as I thought about it and pondered it, I was like, yeah, Lord, I'll do that. But in the back of my mind, I knew the solution to the faith step that He was presenting to me. I knew how I could make it work. So I said, yeah, God, I'll do it. And then shortly thereafter, the card I had in my back pocket fell through. It was no longer going to make the situation work. And I realized, oh man, now we're actually walking in faith. I kind of fooled myself into thinking I was walking in faith, but until the card in my back pocket disappeared, I realized I was actually really just walking in faith of myself, or what I could do, or the solution I could bring. And God said, let me take that card in your back pocket, let me teach you something about faith. When you don't know how it's going to work out, when you don't know how the cards add up or how it adds up on paper, now we're actually walking in faith. Because sometimes we're praying and we're believing God for something. Maybe it's an open door. And even as God begins to open that door, we hesitate to step because we want to know all the details about going into that door. God may have opened up the first step, but we're like, no, I want to know all the details before I'm going to take that step. That's not faith. We're just fooling ourselves. Or like me the other week, it might be, oh yeah, God, I'll take that step of faith, but in the back, we're actually leaning on ourselves. We're actually leaning on what we know we can do, or what we think are our resources or our solutions. And that's not faith either. There's an intimacy in faith where we're saying, God, I have no idea how this will work, but I'll take the step. So we're going to talk about that today. You can turn with me to James 2. We're going to start in verse 18. But it starts off saying, but someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I'll show you my faith by my works. You believe that God is one, you do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. Do you want to be shown, you foolish person, that faith apart from works is useless? Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by his works. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. And he was called a friend of God. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. And in the same way, was not also Rahab, the prostitute, justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way? For as the body apart from the spirit is dead, so also faith apart from works is dead. So there's some very pointed phrases in that passage. He's speaking very firmly about this dynamic of faith. He's speaking in such a way that I don't know about you, but it makes me uncomfortable a little bit. When you first read that, you're like, man, that's some firm talk right there. And there are several different aspects of faith we could break down. There's saving faith, by grace through faith, not by works, lest no one should boast. There's the gifts of faith. There's praying in faith. Today we're going to talk specifically about steps of faith, specifically about our decisions that involve faith, our personal decisions when there's a fork in the road and we have a decision to make. We're going to talk about steps of faith today. But I'm going to propose a definition of what faith is. And we're going to break it down through Scripture. But faith equals belief plus works. Another way you could say that is faith equals trust plus action. Okay, faith equals trust plus action. There's a certain type of shallow belief, and he refers to it a little bit in this passage, where you believe God is one. That's great. The demons do too. Demons definitely aren't walking in faith. So just because you believe something about God doesn't mean you're walking in faith. You could just have a bunch of knowledge or a bunch of thoughts about God. But there's not a true trust. There's not a true belief that God is who he says he is. There's not a true dependence. When we have that true trust, that depth of trust, it actually elicits action on our behalf. When we truly trust someone, it changes the decisions we make. You ever have someone that says they trust a person or a situation, or maybe they trust you, but then they won't let you have any influence on their well-being? They don't trust you. Sometimes we do that with God. God, I trust you. I'll do all these things. And then God's like, hey, what about taking this step? And we're like, oh, no, that's not wise. That doesn't add up. We should be, we got to be safe. We got to think about our families. We got to do all this stuff. God's like, do you trust me? Do you really trust me? Because if there's a true depth of trust, if we truly believe God is who he says he is, and we have trust, we have a relationship with him, it changes our actions. It changes the steps we're willing to take. Now, on the other hand, if faith equals trust plus action, if you take trust out, if you take belief out, if you take that submission to Jesus out, and we're just doing actions, actions aren't faith either. You could do all kinds of actions and not be walking in faith. Maybe you're walking in faith in yourself. Maybe you're walking in faith in this world, but just because we're doing things doesn't mean we're operating in faith. There's this belief, there's this trust that's put to action in Jesus. In verse 20, he poses the question. He says, "You foolish people, do you need me to show you why faith without works is useless?" Is useless if there's nothing put to action. It's like in Hebrews 11:6, without faith, it's impossible to please God. So without works, faith is useless, or you really don't have faith at all. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. Why? Is it because God just wants a workforce? He just wants us to do things for him? No. He wants intimacy. And there's intimacy in trust. What pleases God is intimacy with you. If you're only willing to do the things that you can control, you're actually keeping yourself from being deep and intimate with the Lord. So without faith, it's impossible to please God, because without faith, we're holding back from God. So we're holding back intimacy that he desires. He is pleased by intimacy. And without faith, there's not that trust. There's not that dependence. There's not that willingness to say, I am fully yours and you're fully mine. You call and I'll answer. He desires that. And so faith pleases God because there's a depth of intimacy that comes with faith. The full verse, Hebrews 11:6 says, "And without faith it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God," that intimacy, that action of drawing near, "must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him." In the King James it says, "must believe that he is." Do you believe that he is who he says he is? Are you drawing near? Because if you're drawing near, you have to believe he is who he says he is. He wants that intimacy. He wants that faith. He wants that dependence and that trust. That trust that's so deep that it elicits a change in our action, a change in our response, a transformation of our life, what we do, how we think, where we go, how we respond. Verse 22, he's talking about Abraham. You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by his works. So again, this is where we get that faith is active. You could believe something and never act on it. Faith is active. And he says it's actually completed by the action. It's completed by the works. That step, that vulnerability. Faith without action is like a firework without a lighter. It's like a car without a key. It's like a body without a spirit. Incredible potential, but not set into motion. Incredible capacity, but no ignition. We go on to verse 24. This is why he says, "So also faith apart from works is dead." If you got a firework without a lighter, you may as well not have a firework. Maybe you'll have a lighter at a different part of your life or a different point in time. You could have all kinds of fireworks set out and not have a lighter, and you'll have some nice, art around your backyard. But he says to such a degree that faith apart from works is dead. Faith apart from trust that leads to action is dead. There's an intimacy that we lose or we sacrifice by holding tightly to the things that we can see. Because if we look at other parts of Scripture, faith involves what you can't see. See, when I was taking my step of faith, I was making the decision of faith based on what I could see. That's not faith. Faith involves what we don't see. We walk by faith and not by sight. So he's saying in this passage that you can't separate faith from action. Like Randy Clark says it, faith is spelled R-I-S-K. Faith is spelled R-I-S-K. In this passage, he refers to a couple examples. He refers to Abraham. Would you say taking a knife, going up a hill, setting up an altar, putting your son, tying him down, taking a knife to him is risky? There's a little bit of risk involved in that. Same with Rahab, the other example he uses. She comes and she houses the spies. Her life was on the line, but through faith, she recognized what was God. There was a trust there. She acted upon it, and she acted in faith, but there was a risk involved with that. Oftentimes, if we look at moments of great faith in Scripture, there are two common things that are put on the table that are risked when great faith is seen throughout the Bible. One umbrella, you could say, is your well-being. It could be your safety, your security, your comfort, your preferences, well-being. The other is reputation. Think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were risking their well-being. All these other people were bowing down. They were just saying, oh, you could just do it once real quick and nobody will think twice about it. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are saying, no, not even once, not even a knee, nothing. Our God will save us, and even if he doesn't, we're still not bowing down. There was a risk involved in their faith to such an extent that they were thrown into a fire. Not burned up. They got to walk with Jesus in the fire. They came out and they didn't even smell like smoke. Their faith involved risk, but they got to see God move in extraordinary ways. Think of the woman that bled for 12 years. There's this crowd around Jesus. Everybody wants to see Jesus. This woman, based on her condition, was not supposed to be out in public in that culture. And yet she knew that if she just touched the hem of his garment, there was this great faith, but there was risk involved. After she touches his garment, she's healed. She knows she's healed. Jesus turns around and says, who touched me? The disciples are like, what do you mean? There's people everywhere. He's like, no, who touched me? And it says that she came, this is Luke 8, she came trembling and falling down before him, declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him. She was trembling. She was not supposed to be in a crowd like that. She risked her well-being to get to Jesus. And she was healed. Great faith. Now, how about reputation? I think of blind Bartimaeus. Blind Bartimaeus in Mark 10 is sitting off to the side of the road, and he hears that Jesus is walking by. And he cries out, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And everybody's trying to hush him. Shh, don't bother Jesus. And all the louder, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. He just goes off. He didn't care what people thought. He didn't care about the people hushing him or the people trying to put him off in a box on the side. He wasn't worried about his reputation. He knew that Jesus could heal him. And he was willing to make a scene because the one who could heal him was walking by. He wasn't concerned with his reputation. Think of Jairus. He was a ruler of the synagogue, comes to Jesus to heal his daughter. That was risky for his reputation. Jesus wasn't thought very well of among the religious class. So Jairus, a ruler of the synagogue coming, that was risking his reputation among a lot of people that didn't think fondly of Jesus. There was a risk involved. He said, I'm going to Jesus. How about the paralytic man? There's this packed house. Nobody can get in or out. Friends are bringing their friend who's a paralytic. They just decide to go up on the roof. They just start digging the roof out. I don't even know if they knew whose house it was. They didn't care about their reputation. They didn't care about any of that stuff. They said, we're bringing our friend to Jesus. And we get to see great faith where their friend is healed. But oftentimes there's risk involved in faith. There's some element of mystery. There's some element of pieces that we can't reconcile ourselves when we're approached with the opportunity to take that step. Let's turn to Matthew. We're going to go to Matthew 14. As we're connecting these pieces of trust, put to action, involved in faith, as well as the risk involved when we say yes to Jesus. The intimacy that we have opportunity for when we say yes to Jesus. So Matthew 14, we're going to start in verse 22. Immediately, he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It's a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." So this passage starts out and it says, immediately he made the disciples get into the boat to cross the sea. Okay, remember that. Jesus commanded them to get in the boat and cross the sea. And it says he did this while he dismissed the crowds. What was he dismissing the crowds from? Jesus had just fed the 5,000. He had just fed 5,000 men, not including women and children. There had just been this incredible miracle. So you can imagine the disciples were on this mountaintop experience. They just got to see God work in impossible ways through them. You know, he broke the bread and then he gave it to the disciples after they had gotten people in clusters and the disciples were giving out the bread. And they're probably thinking, man, he just kept giving us bread. There weren't even that many loaves. And we just kept getting the bread and everybody ate. And did you see the 12 baskets? I can't even believe 12 baskets. We didn't even start with one basket of bread. And we ended with 12. How does that? They were on cloud 9. Mountaintop experience with the Lord. But he sends them in a boat. Notice what Jesus does is it says he went off himself to pray. Jesus modeled to us that one of the most important times to get alone with the Lord is after the mountaintop experience. The most important time to refix our gaze sometimes is after we've seen God do something incredible through us. Because the enemy, he'll try and get you in either ditch. If something goes really well, we see God move. If we're not careful, if we don't humble ourselves and refix our eyes on Jesus, the enemy will start to feed us pride. Oh man, you did really well. You really articulated that well. You really nailed that sermon. You really nailed that event. You really nailed that conversation with that person. Versus Jesus says, no, even after I've seen God move, I'm going to go back. I'm going to fix my eyes back on the Father. I'm here for the Father. I'm not here for myself. I'm here to glorify the Father. I'm here to do what I see him doing. I'm here to say what I hear him saying. He modeled for us what to do. Now, on the flip side, like I said, the enemy will get you in either ditch. If something doesn't go well, he'll try and drag you into the ditch of shame, the ditch of hopelessness, the ditch of discouragement. So whether it's a mountaintop experience or a valley experience, he modeled for us regularly getting alone with the Father. That's really important. But so the disciples get into the boat, and they're probably amped. They go out, and they hit the storm of storms. You know, we talk about the Sea of Galilee, and the fact that it's called the Sea of Galilee makes it seem like this massive expanse. It's really actually a lake that's only twice as big as Lake Washington. Kind of similar. It's more long vertically than widthwise. But it shouldn't take them that long to get across the sea. And yet Jesus is out praying. It says that when evening came, Jesus was alone. So you think they probably finished up dinner. He sent him across the boat. Evening came. Jesus was alone. And it is not till the fourth watch of the night. What is the fourth watch of the night? That's like 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. So disciples go from this mountaintop experience, all of a sudden they're fighting for their lives all night on this lake that's really not that big, in a boat that's pretty small. The boat they were probably in was probably only 27 feet long. It probably only held a couple more people than were actually in the boat. So they're packed into this small boat, and they're getting beat on by the waves, beat on by the wind. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the disciples were thinking in the back of their minds as they're struggling to stay alive, they're thinking, but Jesus told us to get in the boat. He commanded us to get in the boat, and now we're in this storm. Why wouldn't he just tell us not to get in the boat? They're probably wrestling. They're literally struggling for their lives. In the fourth watch of the night, it says he came to them, walking on the sea. Know that Jesus comes to you in the midst of the storm. Jesus shows up even when you're battling the wind and the waves and all chaos is breaking out. You feel like you're struggling for your life. Jesus comes to you. And when Jesus shows up, everything changes. He came to them, walking on the water. Now, as we finish out the story, as we read, it doesn't seem like calming the storm was Jesus' first priority. That's also interesting. He didn't run up on the water and say, oh, okay, and he calmed the whole storm. The storm's going, the storm's beaten, and he walks up to them. I find that interesting. When the disciples saw him, they thought it was a ghost. They were freaking out. They're like, what in the world is out there on the waves? But then Jesus speaks out through the storm. He says, take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid. And we don't know all the details of this moment, this scene, but the way I picture it, everything, all the other concerns, the boat, the wind, the waves, the straps, whatever, I just picture it as everything stopped. Like Peter recognized, I know that voice. All the other things he's struggling with, all the other things that are running through his mind, I just picture it. He knows the voice and he looks. And he sees a silhouette and he's like, I know that voice. Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid. And you can imagine what's running through Peter's mind, all their minds. Could it be? Could it be him? And then notice what Peter says. Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. That was Peter's idea. It wasn't like Jesus came walking on the water and said, Peter, if you really have faith, you'll get out of the boat. Peter goes, Jesus, if it's you, call me out. That's all I need to know. I don't need to analyze the height of the waves. I don't need to check the wind. I don't need to try and determine if this boat can hold together any longer. If it's you, I want to be with you. If that's you on the water, Jesus, it doesn't matter how ridiculous of an idea it is, I want to be with you. I want to be on the water with you. Because if it's you and you call me out, I know I can walk on water too, but you have to call me. You can imagine the disciples hearing Peter say that. They're probably like, what in the world? Who gave you that idea? Who in their right mind would say, God, call me to step out of the boat? He was captivated. He desired to be with Jesus. Jesus came, but he was still a ways off. And there was the opportunity for Peter to go out. He says, Jesus, if that's you, say the word, I'll come out. And notice verse 29, Jesus responds. Come. That's it, one word, come. He's not trying to prove his point. He's not trying to elaborate on how this could or couldn't work, how we'll make it work. He's not trying to sugarcoat it. He's not trying to put any other stipulations on it. He just says one word, come. Why? Trust. In relationship, Peter learned Jesus' voice. You don't learn someone's voice distinctly until you've been in relationship. You could meet someone once and then they call you on the phone and they're like, hey, and you're like, I have no idea who's talking to me. But you know someone, it doesn't matter who or where they call you from. You pick up the phone, you hear your voice, you're like, oh, hey, Joseph. You learn someone's voice in relationship. Peter had learned Jesus' voice in relationship. Even when Jesus was just a silhouette, he's like, I know that voice. But he also developed trust in relationship. Jesus knew that trust was there. Jesus knew all he had to say was one word. He says, come. Verse 29, so Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. So he gets out of the boat. He walks to Jesus. His eyes are fixed on Jesus. Then once he gets to Jesus, it says that his attention was taken to the wind, to the waves. What you fix your eyes on determines where you're going. When he was fixed on Jesus, he was going towards Jesus. It didn't matter that it's impossible to walk on water. His faith was in the one in front of him. When the gaze of his eyes, when the gaze of his attention changed, when it was turned to the wind and the waves, he began to go to the wind and the waves. But notice he cries out, even in that moment where he's distracted, he takes his eyes off Jesus, he cries out, and it says that immediately Jesus grabbed him. Immediately he brought him up. He says, oh, you have little faith, why did you doubt? And in verse 32, and when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. That's when the wind ceased. The wind ceasing was like the aftermath of this intimate moment that he had with Peter. Sometimes we think of that moment where Peter starts walking on the water before he sinks. We forget that Peter got to walk back to the boat with Jesus. Him and Jesus just walking on the water. I don't know how far it was, but that's incredible. Just him and Jesus walking in the impossible. They get back to the boat. As they're walking back to the boat, the wind's still howling. The waves are still all over the place. But they step back in the boat, and then the wind ceased. And it says in verse 33, and those in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. So no doubt, the disciples in the boat got to see something extraordinary. And there was some level of intimacy with those that were still in the boat. I'm sure that was a story they talked about. But there's a greater depth of intimacy that Peter got to experience with Jesus. Because he said, I want to be out of the boat. There was a trust he had with Jesus that led to action, that led to intimacy in the moment of that step of faith. Or when Jesus calls us out of the boat, when he says something that seems impossible to us, our first thought shouldn't be all the disastrous possibilities. It should be, I want intimacy with Jesus. I don't want to just see what he does from afar. I want to walk on the water with him. There's that childlike faith that becomes really simple. There's that childlike faith that's really not all that analytical like we are sometimes. It's that childlike faith to realize, like a little kid with his dad. A little kid could be with his dad and there's something that happens in front of him. There's some obstruction, some obstacle, some danger, but he's like, my dad's here. Even if you're a dad and there's been times where you're like really intimidated by what's in front, the kid's like, yeah, Dad, get him. He's not analyzing the situation based off of all the other factors. He just knows my dad's here. That's all that matters to him. You know, there are times growing up, you know, we'd go out and we'd have like a special dinner or celebrated birthday or something, and we might go to a nicer restaurant. As a kid, I'm not thinking, oh man, is my dad able to pay for that check? If my dad brought me there, I know that he's planning to pay for the check. As a kid, I'm not stressed about it. Now, same on the flip side. There were Taco Tuesdays. We'd go to Del Taco and get 3 tacos for $1. Imagine that. I wasn't thinking, oh man, Dad's broke. We're going down. I was like, no, we're going to Taco Tuesday. There's a simplicity as a kid that you're not analyzing all the details that we tend to start analyzing as adults. What matters is, where's Dad? And where's he taking us? All the other details are not my concern. All the other details are not the thing I'm stressing and mulling over. What's Dad doing? What's Dad saying? That's all I need to know. Even if what seems impossible is right in front of me, what's Dad doing? What's Dad saying? That was the simple childlike faith that Peter had. When all chaos was breaking out, when they're slaving for their lives, when they don't know if they're going to make it to the other side, when they're wondering, why did Jesus abandon me? When they're wondering, why doesn't Jesus just calm the storm? Peter was thinking on a different track. He said, I know that voice. I trust that voice. If it's him, I want to be out there with him. He asked to be called out of the boat. But in the midst of asking, he waited for the call. It was his heart's desire, same as our heart's desire can be, Jesus, would you call me out of the boat? It might seem ridiculous to people around us, but Jesus, would you call us out of the boat? And we wait for that comment. What's he saying? Come. And then he gets out, and there's that intimacy that's established in a new depth. Are we going to be people who just believe things about God? Or are we going to pursue a depth of trust with him that actually causes us to say yes when he calls, that causes us to ask him to do radical things, to ask him to call us out into impossible things? Are we going to be people who have the audacity, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to put our life on the line in faith, even if we end up in a fire? Are we going to be people who walk in such an audacity like Peter to say, I'm willing to get out of the boat. I'm willing to do what nobody has ever done before because I see Jesus doing it in front of me and I want to be with him? Are we willing to live with such audacity to believe that God is who he says he is? To take steps of faith where we're like, God, I hear your voice. I have no idea how it'll work. Do we have the audacity to say yes? Do we have a hunger for intimacy that supersedes all our other questions? I want to be in intimacy with Jesus. I want to experience that depth of faith where I don't have any borders with Jesus. I don't have any restrictions, any walls. There's no blackout dates. I'm in covenant with him. Everything I am is his, and everything he is mine. All I need to know is that he's calling me. I want him. There are different theories on some of the miracles of Jesus and the faith that we see. We don't know all the details of this moment that Peter was stepping out on the water. But knowing other references of faith and other stories and how God works in these situations, I don't imagine that when Peter decides to take that step out of the boat, I don't imagine that he steps over and hits solid ground, like when he's doing the little test with his toe. I don't imagine it was just like this solid ground that he's like, oh, I can walk on water. My guess is that when he reached over the boat, again, it's not a big boat, it's probably only that high. He reached over, it's probably swaying and everything. He's probably holding on. I bet his toe went right through the water. That's my guess. Because otherwise it wouldn't require any faith. If you already see it, then you know what's going to happen if you shift your weight. My guess is his toe broke through and he had to make the decision, am I still going to step? Am I going to shift my weight? Am I going to risk it all and maybe end up in this lake? And then I believe he shifted his weight, he took that step of faith, and then his foot caught. That's how I think it went. Because again, if we're able to control the steps of faith, it's really not faith anymore. There's this moment where we say, Jesus, like a little kid, I'm jumping into your arms. Nothing I can do when I leave that ledge. And Jesus shows up. Go and stand with me. We're going to take these last few minutes and just reflect as we sing. We're going to fix our eyes on Jesus. We're going to ask him, Jesus, would you give me that attentiveness of your voice that even in the midst of chaos and storms around me, I recognize when you show up. I recognize when you speak. That we ask him, God, I want to have that hunger for you with no walls, full covenant. I want to have that desire to walk in faith with you. I want to desire that intimacy. It's like we read in Hebrews 11, without faith it's impossible to please God because his pleasure is tied to his relationship with us. He wants depth of relationship. He wants full covenant. He wants full union, nothing to separate us. And so we're just going to take this time as we sing and reflect and give that opportunity. Jesus, would you call me out onto the water? Don't even wait for him to ask you to do something. Ask him, Jesus, would you call me out on the water? I want to be with you. I know if you give me the green light, if you say come, it doesn't matter what physics says. I'll be walking on water with you. Jesus, would you come and give us that depth? We want to know you. We want to be with you. Come and take us deeper.